Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's program. So what is going on in Israel today, right? 12 weeks of nationwide protests, hundreds of thousands of people all across Israel in the streets. By the way, that'd be equivalent, I figured out, to about 9 million Americans out on the street. So pretty significant. And I'm proud to say, basically been fairly peaceful. It's been reported that 70% of Israeli society has concerns about judicial reforms as they've been proposed. Military reservists have refused to serve. High-tech companies were sounding the alarm. Money was leaving the country. Just on Sunday, Prime Minister Netanyahu fired Defense Minister Gallant, a fellow Likudnik, by the way, for calling for a delay in the judiciary overhaul plans. Then yesterday, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced a pause on the overhaul push to enable dialogue and avoid civil war. Not surprisingly, depending on what you read and who you speak to, the current situation in Israel is either one, a constitutional crisis that will end democracy in Israel, or two, a needed change to rebalance the power between the courts and the Knesset, as courts have become increasingly aggressive and have undermined voters' choices. And all that is what we're hoping to unpack for you today. So my name is Ephraim Seidman. I'm chair of the Israel Education and Advocacy Subcommittee of the JCRC. The JCRC, or the Jewish Community Relations Committee, is the public advocacy and relations arm of the Jewish Community Federation of Richmond. As many on this call already know, the Federation of Richmond represents the almost 15,000 Jewish constituents in the greater Richmond and Central Virginia region. We are excited to welcome Haviv back to Richmond, at least remotely. It's been almost 3 years ago to the day that we had our first conversation with Haviv. Someday, Haviv, we need to do this in person, by the way. Haviv Wetek-Gur is a veteran Israeli journalist who serves as senior analyst for the Times of Israel. He has covered Israel's politics, foreign policy, the education system, and relationships with the Jewish diaspora since 2005, having reported from over 20 countries. He served as director of communications for the Sachnut, the Jewish Agency for Israel, Israel's largest NGO, and has taught at prestigious pre-military academies. And as we know from our previous conversation with Haviv, he also has a personal interest in the space program and the judo scene in Israel. Also on today's call is Basia Gardenstein. Some of you may have already had the pleasure of meeting Basia. Basia lived in Israel for 5 years and attended Reichman University, formerly known as IDC Herzliya, earning a BA in government, specializing in international affairs and conflict resolution. After multiple years of work in the field of Muslim-Jewish relations, she earned a Master's of Divinity at Yale University and wrote her thesis on the role of religion in conflict transformation. She went on to implement her skills at the Regional Organization for Peace, Economics, and Security, or ROPES, where she brought together young diplomats, entrepreneurs, and venture capitalists to create a coalition of Israelis, Palestinians, and Arabs throughout the Middle East to build momentum towards a viable peace deal. Basia also speaks Hebrew and Arabic fluently. Basia is, of course, our director of our JCRC and is our one and only professional staff member. Basia and Haviv will chat for about 40 to 45 minutes and then field questions from the audience. Participants are able to submit questions at any time today using the chat button on the bottom of your screen. Please send those directly to me. We're expecting a lot of questions today, so our program will likely run over a bit. If you could hang in there with us, I think it will be well worth your time. And lastly, we'll be talking a lot about Israel's Beit Mishpat Gavoa. So in English, you might hear us say high or upper court, or even call it the Supreme Court, but they're all the same thing. With only days remaining until the Knesset breaks for its April recess for Pesach, even with this current pause, this still may very well be a decisive week. And we're privileged to have Haviv to walk us through it all. So Bastian, Haviv, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ephraim. Thank you for the introduction. We're here at a more timely moment than we could have ever anticipated given the current events this week. Thank you, Javier, for taking your time to be here with us. And it's great to have all of you on the call today from the community to learn more about the proposed judicial reform that you cannot escape, whether it's in the news or on the streets, coming from Israel into America. I would like to kick off with setting the stage for what we'll delve into together. So Javier, can you tell us exactly what the reforms are that everyone is speaking so much about?
Yeah, Basia, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. The reforms are a set of laws, a set of bills. There are probably 11 or 12 different moving parts. It's very, very complex. They're amending a whole lot of Israel's basic laws, which are the sort of almost constitutional, sometimes not, set of laws by which our government is structured and run. I want to focus in on 3 of those 11 moving parts, let's say, just to give a sense of what actually we're talking about. The 3 I want to focus on are I think the ones that Israelis understand the most about and are of the most concern. One is a law called the override law, the override clause that this government wants to pass. The details are a little bit dry, but it's important to walk through the weeds in order to come out and see things a little differently. The override clause would, if the Israeli Supreme Court rules that something is unconstitutional or extremely unreasonable or in some other way not permissible, then the Knesset will be able to override it by a simple vote of 61. 61 votes in the Knesset is the smallest majority you can have out of 120 members of the parliament. And so and by definition in a parliamentary system, a government has a majority in parliament. And so essentially it erases the capacity of the Supreme Court to say anything or rule unconstitutional, anything the government doesn't like. One major piece, which was advancing this week and was actually set to pass today, and because of the mass protest this week and the political pressure and the National Labor Federation declaring a mass national strike and all of the things, the very dramatic events of this week actually has been paused for now, probably for 2-3 months, as Ephraim said. But that was the judicial appointments. The Judicial Appointments Committee is going to be changed in this bill to make it much, much easier. Essentially, the government alone, the majority coalition in parliament, which is also the executive branch, will be able to appoint justices to the Supreme Court without having to reach across the aisle to the opposition. We don't have multiple centers of power that can veto each other in this country. We're a classic parliamentary system. And so it's not even a president and a Senate have to agree on an appointment. It would just literally be the government. And so that's a very dramatic change, giving the government a majority on the Judicial Appointments Committee. And the third dramatic change that's worth mentioning is the basic laws. They want to make the basic laws of Israel immune to judicial review. What that means is if something is passed as a basic law, the Supreme Court can't rule it unconstitutional. That makes perfect sense. The Constitution can't be ruled unconstitutional. But there is a difference between Israel's basic laws and constitutional laws in the English-speaking world, in France, in Germany. And that difference is that the basic laws can be changed very, very easily by simple majorities. They're not protected in any way. They're not resilient to just momentary majorities in parliament. And in fact, they're changed constantly. They were changed 23 times in the last 5 years. And so to make basic laws immune to judicial review makes sense. The Supreme Court, by the way, has never struck down a basic law. And so it's not even a precedent that they're fighting back against. But it doesn't make sense to say they're immune to judicial review and also don't need to have a larger majority, let's say 80 seats, which forces the coalition to reach across the aisle or something like that. And so they want a constitution they can change at a whim. They want to be able to just literally vote down any Supreme Court decision with a simple majority. And they want to appoint the justices with only the government, only the simple majority. And there are many, many other changes requiring a supermajority in the court to even try to throw something out, to declare something unconstitutional in the first place, limiting the reasonableness test. If anyone here is lawyers, this makes sense to you. But just to move on, essentially, in multiple ways and multiple times, they're essentially nulling and voiding the Supreme Court, and there will be nothing really left other than the government in terms of checks and balances in the system.
Thank you so much for that explanation, Javiv. And I think it'd be helpful, especially since the majority of the people on this call are American, to just dig a little bit further into the way that the Israeli and American systems of governance differ from one another. Could you speak to some other key ways that the checks and balances in Israel differ from the way that they do in the United States?
Sure. So, folks, I want to start with the comparison to the United States is very helpful because it demonstrates why the Israeli right wing is correct. It's correct about the Israeli Supreme Court. The Israeli Supreme Court is an outlier in the democratic world. It is the most powerful court in the democratic world. There are legal categories that they sound dry, they sound lawyerly, they're really fundamental. For example, in standing. Standing is who can actually appeal to the Supreme Court. If the government of the United States does something wrong to somebody somewhere in Virginia, someone in California can't appeal that problem to the United States court system, right? You don't have standing. You have to show that you've been affected by this thing that someone else has done in order to sue about it, right? You can't just sue because someone else hurt someone, some third party somewhere else. In Israel, standing is almost universal. Now, there's almost anyone can appeal to the Supreme Court against almost anything the government is doing to almost anyone else. And in fact, there are NGOs that this is their business. They just file thousands of appeals to the Supreme Court every year. The Israeli Supreme Court hears something like 5,000 of these appeals a year. And that's not something that exists in any other court in the world. Justiciability. Justiciability is the term for what are the topics that a court can actually deal with. The American Supreme Court, for example, if, for example, the President of the United States signs an international treaty without getting permission from the Senate. Now, the Senate has to approve an international treaty in the Constitution. Then the US Supreme Court can step in and say, hey, you cannot, Mr. President, sign a treaty without approval by the Senate. But the Supreme Court cannot say, we don't like what's in the treaty. Please negotiate the treaty to have different content. This is not appropriate policy. That is beyond the justiciability category, right? It's not something that a court is empowered or capable, has the tools to really deal with. And the Israeli Supreme Court rules on almost everything, including the content of laws, including striking down single line items in laws, including what a reasonable policy is or is not. The Israeli Supreme Court is extraordinarily powerful. And there's something else the Israeli court has that's very different from America and from almost every other democracy. There are some democracies that are a little bit similar in terms of judicial appointments, like Ireland is moving in that direction. But the Israeli Supreme Court essentially has a veto on appointments to itself. It can vet appointments to itself. The Judicial Appointments Committee, as it stands right now, the Supreme Court has 3 members out of 9. The coalition and government have 3 members out of 9. There's another member of Knesset who's sometimes opposition, sometimes coalition, and there are 2 members of the Bar Association. You didn't have to follow all of that, but if you did follow all of that, you need to know that 7 votes need to be there to vote someone onto the Supreme Court, 7 out of 9. Now, if you did that math, first of all, well done you're a computer programmer. Second of all, if you did that math, you understand that the government has a veto. 3 out of 9 means that no one can have 7 without you. A veto on who's appointed to the court, and the court has a veto. And folks, in hundreds, maybe thousands of appointments, in all appointments in 20 years, the 3-member Supreme Court delegation has never split their vote. And so in practice, the Supreme Court has a veto of appointments to the court. Now, what that means is, generally I'm finishing making the case for the right, and then we'll switch to the left. Just what that means is that the Supreme Court, in the democratic world, as a rule, the more powerful the court, the more there's political say in appointments to the court. So, for example, the American Supreme Court is considered a very powerful court. It can strike down legislation. It can, for example, Roe v. Wade, both passing Roe v. Wade in the 70s and now overturning Roe v. Wade. For example, I think it was 2014, gay marriage. That's a very powerful court. And because it's a powerful court, The appointments to the court are political. They're a mixture of the president appointing, a president nominating, and the Senate approving. And that's in order to rein in the power of this very powerful court. In Britain, for example, a court has almost none of those powers. It cannot strike down legislation, or in very, very rare cases. And because it's much, much less powerful, it has an internal appointment mechanism that's much more professionalized in the justice ministry and in the judiciary itself. In general, there's a reverse correlation. If you're a very powerful court, politicians appoint you. And if you're a much weaker court, then you appoint yourself or have a veto, or there's a much more professional appointment process. The Israeli court is an absolute outlier. It is both extraordinarily powerful, more powerful than the American court, and also has a veto on its own appointments. And now I want to switch over to the left or the center left. The problem with weakening that court, and it makes sense to weaken that court. And by the way, when you ask the question as a general question, do you think the Israeli Supreme Court should be weakened? You ask that in a poll, most Israelis say yes, including people protesting against this reform. The problem is that we have probably the simplest system of government in the world. We have almost no checks of any kind anywhere else in government. What do I mean by that? As I said, we're a parliamentary system like Britain, like Australia, like Canada. We have a parliament, and out of that parliament, a government is elected. And that means that by definition, a government must have the confidence of parliament, which means the government always has a majority in parliament. But Israel is even more so than in other parliamentary democracies. In Canada, in Australia, in Britain, there is a direct election mechanism for members of parliament. A member of parliament is elected from a specific district by specific voters, and therefore it has an independent standing facing their party leader. In Israel, we don't have direct election. The entire country is a single constituency, and that single constituency, Israeli voters only elect party lists. They get to vote for the name of a party. Who actually staffs that list? Who actually puts the actual individuals on that list? In almost every case, the party leader. Very, very few parties have actual primaries. Likud is the biggest party with party primaries. But in practice, in Likud, Netanyahu's word is law. And so, and on the center left, by the way, it's worse. In other words, there's a more so. There aren't even primaries. It's literally just Yair Lapid appointing his entire list. And so if I'm number 12 on the Yesh Atid list or number 14 on the Likud list, who am I answerable to? Who do I understand gave me my job? And the answer is the party leader. And so in practice, the party leaders, who by definition make up the government, literally appointed most of the members of parliament. And so in Israel, it's not just that we're a parliamentary system and therefore there's less checks and balances and vetoes and all the things that you have in America. It's that, in fact, the government appointed in practice with internal party mechanisms the actual members of parliament who are supposed to be another branch reining them in. So they can't rein them in. Folks, because we have maybe the simplest electoral system, the simplest system of government in the world, by the way, that's why the Supreme Court became so powerful over the decades. And if you now weaken that court, Israelis on the center left, that half of the country represented in those protests over the last 12 weeks, they're absolutely right. There isn't anything else. The parliamentary majority, which if it's united, as it is in this government, essentially is unstoppable in any way. And there isn't even a court mechanism that can rein them in. And so there is this argument on the right that's powerful, that's important, that's not going away. Even if the right is defeated now, the frustration is going to stay, and the attempts to reform that court are going to come back. But on the other side, the fear is absolutely correct. There are going to be no more checks and balances left once that court is weakened.
Thank you so much for all that explanation. And I'm wondering if we can hone in a bit more on you presented two different sides to the arguments, and hopefully everyone's gotten a bit more context around what's raging in the streets right now. Can you speak to the context of this government that this is happening within, and whose interests are or are not being met by the degree of reform around the issues that you outlined at the start of the call?
Yeah, a lot of what's happening, in a sense, there's a sense in which at the sort of superficial level, this is a debate about institutions and about our constitutional order. And that is not a superficial debate. That's a profound and important debate. But that's the tip of the iceberg. There is a culture war happening here. Israeli society is a deeply tribal society. It's a society of cultural and religious and ethnic subgroups that really live apart and feel themselves. It's not an accident that this country for 75 years has had a single constituency, proportional representation, as it's called, system of elections, which is to say, Israelis vote for a party list. What those party lists are meant to reflect is those cultural tribes. In other words, we are a political system built for the ultra-Orthodox to express their relative size in the population in parliament, or the secular left, or the religious Zionist modern Orthodox, or in the Arab community, this divides up exactly the same way as in the Jewish community. In other words, the Ra'am party is the conservative Muslim party. They live in different areas of the country from Hadash, which is the progressive urban Arab party, which has a lot of Christians in it, has a lot of doctors in it, has a lot of lawyers in it. And on the other side in Ra'am, is essentially the base of Ram, the most loyal base of Ram are the Bedouin, where they are very conservative, very Muslim, and just a whole different politics. And they vote for a different party, and they have a very different agenda. And that's true among Jews and among Arabs. Incidentally, that's true in the entire Middle East. In other words, for American Jews watching Israel, because we have so much of the same vocabulary and because we have so much of the same culture, it can be hard to notice how profoundly different we are. But of course, more than half of Israeli Jews come from the Arab and Muslim world, and our politics, in terms of our sort of baseline political identity, is structured more or less the way Lebanon is structured. And if you understand, of course, we're more successful than Lebanon, so we haven't fallen in the traps Lebanon has fallen into. But we're a country where that's the basic politics. And what that means is that a lot of this debate over whether the court is powerful or not powerful follows these tribal wars. A lot of the fear on the secular left about this reform is that it's meant to allow the ultra-Orthodox to pass illiberal religious laws that will prevent Israelis from living free lives. A lot of the fear on the right, a lot of the anger with the court has to do with the feeling that there is an elite Ashkenazi, that's of course Jews from European extraction, elite that actually there have been it's only a few Mizrahi Arab world judges on the Israeli Supreme. There have been, and some of them have been some of the finest and some of the most famous and have written some of the most important decisions in the history of the Israeli Supreme Court. But they're outnumbered, I don't know the exact number, educated guess 6-1. In other words, the idea that half the country really is unrepresented in that court isn't, it isn't propaganda. It is profound and it is real and it is felt. And so a lot of this is playing into, it's driving a lot of the visceral, emotions behind this fight.
Thank you. And could you speak a bit, while we're talking about context, of the current leadership in the Knesset, about Likud and specifically about Netanyahu, and how these reforms are affecting him and his party, the proposed reforms?
Yes. Benjamin Netanyahu is an enigma. We are having a debate in Israel about him. Half of Israel, the half represented in the coalition voters, are very loyal to him. They see him as representing them in the face of these old elites, these Ashkenazi elites and elite power structures that they feel don't represent them, don't see them, have neglected and marginalized them. There's a great deal of real history to that frustration. And on the other side, Benjamin Netanyahu is seen as a profoundly corrupt and populist person who has done, he's done some very important things for Israel. He's made some of the most important reforms in the history of the Israeli economy. He has been one of the leaders under Netanyahu. Israel, on average, an average year under Netanyahu, Israel has had the fewest wars, the fewest conflicts, the fewest deaths in either combat or terrorism. Netanyahu shies away from conflict and has generally been a very responsible steward of the Israeli economy. And all of that is true. At the same time, Netanyahu is now pushing laws outside of the judicial reform, separate from the judicial reform. There are laws advancing to allow Netanyahu to, the laws of the country are going to change in order to allow Netanyahu to keep gifts that he received from friends and family members and billionaires. Netanyahu has a long history of just very, very shady dealings with a lot of people, influence peddling, even when in power. And he's, of course, on trial. He's on trial in 3 different cases for corruption. A little bit of a controversial trial because his supporters say it's cooked up. He is on trial for bribery, but the bribe isn't money. It's favorable news coverage, and that's a big debate now. Is favorable news coverage a legitimate legal argument? Is there a legitimate legal argument that favorable news coverage in exchange for policy is, in fact, bribery, right? Even if it's literally dealt with, even if they have recordings of them saying it as a quid pro quo, is that a bribe? So we're having these big debates about Netanyahu. He has led very populist politics. He's said things, he's lied and cheated to so many coalition partners that he really can't promise anymore at the coalition table. And that makes it very difficult for him to form coalitions. And so it's a little bit like Margaret Thatcher. After you're in power for so long, you've made so many enemies, you're the destabilizing factor in politics, even if you're very popular. David Ben-Gurion founded the state, was the indomitable leader of Israeli politics for a decade and a half, and finished his time in politics, I think, at the head of a party with 3 seats in parliament. All politicians who don't resign, who don't retire, fail. In other words, you can't end your political career successful unless you retire early, right? So Netanyahu is deeply hated by one half of the country and seen as the representative against this elite, this marginalizing elite, this very problematic elite by the other half.
And how does that relate to these reforms? So if you could just go into briefly, and then I'll go on to the next question.
Yeah. Well, I would say it's about trust.
Reforms.
The average Israeli is not having a debate about the complexity of how you structure a proper judicial appointments committee, or should we use the Irish method or the French method? The average Israeli is not talking about what number should an override clause have that changes it from undemocratic to kosher, right? The average Israeli is not dealing with the technicalities of the institutional changes. The average Israeli is asking a simple question: do I trust this government to fundamentally change our constitutional order? Do I think that what will come out of it, do I think that the intentions of the government are fundamentally democratic? Or do I think that the intentions of this government are to grab all power it can to itself? Over the last 12 weeks, even as some of the people advancing these reforms have said, we're Democrats, this is about, rebalancing appropriately the powers of the different branches, the court's too powerful, it really is an outlier in the democratic world. They've said that, but while they've said that, they've actually behaved in ways that convinced huge numbers of Israelis, even Israelis who support reform, that in fact their intentions are frankly nefarious. I mean, that their intentions are really very, very bad. For example, there are now bills proposed by members of this coalition. Almog Cohen is a member of Knesset from Otzma Yehudit, the most far-right party in parliament. It is part of this coalition. It is led by a terrorism sympathizer for many, many years who had the picture of Baruch Goldstein, a Jewish terrorist who killed 29 Muslim worshippers at prayer. He had this picture of him hanging in his living room wall for 20 years. That leader of the Otzma Yehudit party, Itamar Ben-Gvir, is now the minister of police. And his member of Knesset, Almog Cohen, has proposed a bill that's not going to pass, but Israelis read it as a sign of intent to allow police searches of homes without warrants. You will not need a court warrant to search someone's home. Well, what are you supposed? On the Israeli right, people rolled their eyes and said it's a press release. It's not really a bill. These people are idiots, and it's a shame that they're ruining it for the rest of us by making us all look bad. But if you don't trust them, if you don't have that trust that this is silly, you should not feel safe. You should feel like what does that mean, proposing a bill that by the member of the party of the police minister himself? There are many other bills. A Likud member of Knesset has proposed a bill to give 12 extra Knesset seats out of 120, 10% more seats to the coalition. If you win, you automatically get 12 more votes in parliament than whatever you got at the election. And the reason that this member of Knesset from Likud gave was that'll mean that we can get the job done. We can pass legislation, we can govern properly, and we don't have to constantly face an opposition that's constantly, hounding us and preventing us from working. That sounds great, but that just means the opposition is completely wiped out and erased. And so this coalition has done everything it possibly could to convince the other half of the country that its intentions were wrong, were evil, were anti-democratic. I am of the opinion, personally, that that those are press releases to the populist base, and in fact, not actually legislation that is intended to pass. But in my own newspaper, my boss, David Horowitz, the founder of my newspaper, is absolutely convinced that when someone tells you they're going to dismantle democracy, you believe them, and that's how we should treat this government. And I have a hard time finding the paper trail, the sort of the breadcrumbs, the data points to prove him wrong. In other words, this government has not given people who are willing to give it the benefit of the doubt, it's not made it an easy time for them to actually give them that benefit of the doubt. And so the fear on the center left is very real. And remember, again, we don't have that very sophisticated constitution that America built, and that that there are these checks and these balances. You not only have a Senate and a House and a president, all of which can check each other, and then a court that can declare something unconstitutional, and then state legislatures that can change the Constitution. That entire mechanism is missing here, but you have even more than that. You have each piece in that mechanism is elected in a different way by a different cross-sectioning of the population and on a different schedule. And the whole point of having the terms be different and the way you elect each institution differently, and to give each of those different cross-sections of the population, different electoral systems, essentially, a veto over all the other ways of running elections in your country. Each institution is a different electoral system. The reason for all of that is to prevent majorities from arising in any one institution and dominating minorities and oppressing minorities. And if you have none of that, as we do, we have none of it, then minorities are always much, much more ready to believe the worst and fearful. And that's what's happening.
Yes, thank you, Habib. That leads me right into the next question I wanted to ask you, which is, we've now outlined a bit of how those in power are being most impacted by this reform and how it might serve in their benefit and how that's fed into people's concern. Could you speak a little bit more about those who aren't in power, and especially those in society who've been coming out in the greatest number to protest, and how this reform would impact them, and what particularities and fears do they harbor? So with special focus on LGBTQ community, Palestinian citizens of Israel or Arab Israelis, and for feminists and the Women of the Wall movement, and to start with those, but any other groups that have been concerned as well, feel free to weave that into your answer.
Yeah, sure. I mean, those are enough.
Right?
Yeah. Essentially, the fear is essentially in the opposition, among the many different kinds of voters who voted for the many, many different kinds of parties in the opposition. There are in the opposition today in Israel very right-wing voters who are horrified at what the right of Israel has become under this government. There are essentially elderly Russians who still vote for a separate Russian-speaking party. There are the LGBT community, the majority of it, not all of it, some of it does vote right, but I think a large majority of it votes left, and all kinds of different groups, Arab Israelis, who in their own politics have many different ways of talking about themselves. Roughly half of them call themselves Palestinian, roughly half of them call themselves Israelis. All of them call themselves all these things, but they rank those many sort of layered identities and complicated in different ways. And that's reflected also in the many parties that represent them. But all these different groups are radically different. In other words, the opposition in Israel is a very, very diverse place. But all of them are reading the map. And the political map at this moment says as follows: Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition has 64 votes. It has 64 seats out of 120. The smallest political party is Otzma Yehudit. Excuse me, there's a one-man party called Noam, which we can leave on the side because it can leave the government and Netanyahu won't care. But the second smallest is Otzma Yehudit, which has 5 seats. Now that means that the Otzma Yehudit party, which only has 5 seats because Netanyahu united it with another religious Zionism party. On its own, it could not get into the Knesset. It actually was polling at under 2% of the electorate. You need 3.25 to get into the Knesset. But it has 5 seats, which is almost 5% of the country, essentially because it negotiated a good deal on the religious Zionism list when it ran together. Long story short, this is the single most right-wing party Israeli politics can produce. This is the Proud Boys. This is the people who have the head of the party, Itamar Ben-Gvir, has been convicted of terrorism offenses. And this is the political party that if it leaves his coalition, Netanyahu loses his government. And so Itamar Ben-Gvir yesterday told Netanyahu when he decided to freeze temporarily to pause the judicial reform, Itamar Ben-Gvir said, well, that's it, I'm leaving. And Netanyahu said, no, please stay. And then Itamar Ben-Gvir said, okay, well, I was talking about this second police force that I'd like to form that's not answerable to all the different chains of command in Israeli politics and to the cabinet itself, but answerable to the minister, to me. So I want that police force. And Netanyahu said, of course. And he gave it to him in writing. And so now we're going to form a police force that will be answerable directly to the most extremist politician in Israeli politics who could not get elected on his own. Netanyahu ran his campaign and pressured the religious Zionism party to join the two parties so that he wouldn't lose any right-wing votes so he could finally win after 5 elections. Now, if you're Arab in this country, Itamar Ben-Gvir has spent a career race baiting you, calling for massive violence to put you in your place, and just been openly racist for his entire career. And he's the police minister Netanyahu needs to keep the coalition alive. And now you have to ask yourself, this Netanyahu fellow, how liberal is he? How liberal isn't he? How much would he compromise his liberalism in order to stay in power? And it is very hard to imagine that he wouldn't compromise it a great deal. We've already seen those compromises. And so the fear is palpable, and it's a fear not because of, PR or media or, it's just the look of the thing. It's a real political calculation. Every Israeli understands, because this is how our system works, the politics of coalitions in the Knesset. And the politics of coalitions in the Knesset make Netanyahu extraordinarily weak and completely subject to the whims of every single one of his coalition partners. You mentioned women and women of the wall. Netanyahu absolutely desperately needs Shas, the Sephardi political party, and he absolutely needs United Torah Judaism, the Ashkenazi political party of the ultra-Orthodox community. And Shas proposed a bill a month ago. Shas proposed a bill that women at the Western Wall who are dressed immodestly, which is against the regulations of the Western Wall. It's a holy site. The standard for dress there is Orthodox. That itself is not controversial in Israel. But that if you're dressed inappropriately, immodestly, there's a 6-month prison sentence for that. That's a crime. That is now a felony. That's a bill proposed by Shas a month ago. It caused a terrible stink, a terrible stir. Diaspora Jews were horrified. Israelis were horrified. And Netanyahu called up Shas and he said to them, what are you guys doing to me? You're making us look bad. You're making us look like the illiberal thing that the opposition claims we are. And so they froze the bill, or they canceled the bill. They threw it out. They took it off the Knesset docket. And Netanyahu was celebrated, by his supporters as, look how liberal he is. He canceled this bill. But Shas was actually very offended. And the Shas leadership said in a press release that they sent to all of us journalists in Israel, they said, guys, this bill, do you understand when I say immodest dress, I don't mean nudity. It is already illegal to go in a bikini in the Western Wall. And it should be. It's a public decency law. And you can't be naked at the Western Wall. That is currently, right now, a crime. What he's talking about, this bill, when it says immodestly, it's talking about elbows. It's talking about sleeves. It's talking about Orthodox religious rules of modesty, which I think are fantastic. I'm the son of a rabbi and I'm married to the daughter of a rabbi. I'm a big fan of Orthodox Judaism. I'm not sure it should be the law and it should carry prison sentences, levels of, right? Shas, and a very hurt Shas said to Netanyahu and said to the public, this bill is in the coalition agreement we signed with Likud in December. It's literally in the appendix to the agreement. Likud signed on the dotted line. This is print. This is in print. Shas took it seriously. And so, yes, the minorities in Israel are watching a government. What they're afraid of is not Netanyahu. What they're afraid of is just how unbelievably weak Netanyahu is. He has made so many enemies that he has no other partner to pull in from the left or from the center left or from any of the opposition parties, including the right-wingers in the opposition. They simply don't trust him. He's lied to too many people, cheated too many people. And so he's stuck to stay in power with the most extreme elements in many, many different spectrums and many different issues of Israeli politics. And so this government is not a government that almost any Israeli minority feels it can trust.
Could you lastly elaborate a little bit as well on how this all is affecting LGBTQ Jews and why they're out on the streets as well?
Yeah. Let me say just a word of background about the LGBT question in Israel. Israel continues to have the old Ottoman family law system, what they call the millet system. Under the Ottoman Empire, which ruled here up until World War I, every religious community actually had courts of its own based on its own religious law. And it wasn't just Jews. Jews had rabbinical courts, Muslims had Sharia courts, Catholics had Catholic canon law courts. And those courts actually ran the community. Those courts were the only place you could get married. They were the only place you could get divorced. They handled burial, personal status, conversion, things like that. In the Ottoman Empire, that was how, and it was true of the entire Ottoman Empire, that was how minority religious communities lived. And because Israelis could never decide what to replace that system with, that system is still in force. And so Israel has no civil marriage, for example, of any kind. For heterosexual Ashkenazi Jews who are wealthy high-tech entrepreneurs, it doesn't matter who you are in society or how much privilege you have, there simply is no civil marriage in Israeli law. You can only marry at a rabbinate or at a Catholic canon law court or in a Sharia court. And that for the LGBT community is more problematic than for everyone else because there is no option, there is no place, because we have so little option. By the way, folks, this is another thing about us that's just very Middle Eastern. Israelis, to get away from the rabbinate, go to Cyprus to get married. The good news is Cyprus is about 40 minutes away by airplane, and the city halls in Cyprus, all the mayor's offices in Cyprus do a very brisk business. They take a nice fee and they'll marry you in about 3 hours. You can be back on the plane back to Israel, and Israel has to recognize a marriage in Cyprus by international treaty. And so the way to get married in Israel with someone who an Orthodox rabbi might not want to marry is simply to do it in Cyprus, and it's very, very convenient and it's fine. In the waiting room at City Hall in Larnaca in Cyprus, the Israeli couples are all sitting elbow to elbow with Lebanese couples, because that's exactly how the system works in Lebanon. In other words, this is true of the entire sort of Ottoman Arab world expanse, and it's one way in which we're just very Middle Eastern. The point is that because there's so few ways to marry in Israel, it's almost too easy to marry in Israel. Since the 90s, slowly, beginning really in the 80s, slowly in our courts have begun to recognize a kind of common law marriage, where if you live together, if you sleep together, that's critical. It's a institution that the courts have used, the old halachic institution, the Talmudic institution called Yeduim B'tzibur, known to the public. A rabbi is traveling around the shtetls of Eastern Europe. He meets a couple. He doesn't know if they're married. The community doesn't know if they're married. Nobody knows what their status is. It's important for some reason. I don't know what. Let's say they're trying to get divorced and one of them is suing the other one for alimony, and the rabbi has to decide, are you married, right? And the answer is, under Talmudic laws of 1800-year-old rules, the answer is, does the community think they're married? If it thinks they're married, mazel tov, you're married. And so that's called known to the public. It's basically English common law rules with a few differences. That is in force in Israel. And so in the 90s already, we have gay couples who found out they were, by the way, they lived together and they slept together and they shared a bank account and they shared rent. And then they broke apart. And one of them, because they were unhappy with how the other one left them, decided to sue for alimony. And the first one said, we were never married. We were just living together. And then they discovered that they had been married because a court declared them retroactively married because one of them sues for. In other words, we have a marriage you might get into accidentally without wanting to. It's so easy to marry and because it's so hard to marry. Long story short, we have this institution. The ultra-Orthodox, so it's this there's a social reality that's very liberal. Up until gay marriage was legalized in America, Israel was slightly ahead of America on this question. Since then, Israel is behind America on this question. But there's a social reality which is very liberal and a legal reality which is probably the least liberal in the West. And there's a huge gap. On many, many questions, on kashrut, on marriage, on divorce, on burial, on conversion, questions that matter to people's lives, the ultra-Orthodox parties want to close those gaps. They want to say, you are married. When a rabbi tells you you're married, there is no other kind of marriage. They want to say the courts invented this thing to respond to a very profound and powerful social reality. The Knesset can't get it together to allow people to marry each other outside of some rabbinate they don't want, so they found a way to marry each other. You take this away from people, that will spark rebellion because the people really want and need to. I, for example, qualify for the rabbinate marriage in every way. My wife and I simply wouldn't do it. So we were married in a city hall in Baltimore and then had an Orthodox wedding in Israel. But we won't marry in the rabbinate, right? And that's many, many, hundreds of thousands of Israeli couples, millions of Israeli households by now. And so they've been passing these or proposing these laws, which haven't passed by most of them, but there's a real fear that they will pass. And the LGBT community is the most afraid. If they take away from me common law marriage, then I'll be annoyed. It'll be annoying to me and I'll feel put upon and I'll have to sign some paperwork somewhere in Cyprus. But if you take it away from the LGBT community, if you take away, for example, recognition, even after they're married in a place like Maryland, because this is not something legitimate in your eyes, folks, common law marriage in Israel is powerful. It's real. You can make end-of-life decisions with Yaduim B'tzibur marriage. You can adopt. You can be sued for alimony. In other words, the powerful rights and responsibilities of marriage exist in this system, and there is an effort and a debate in the ultra-Orthodox parties of how we stop these things, how we bring things back into how we think they should be. And it's not clear when the court is gone and Netanyahu owes them everything, how you protect yourself from that. Mm-hmm. Yep. That was a long way to answer it, but the context is important.
Important education and important explanations. And thank you for highlighting the way that this is affecting certain more vulnerable communities and why they are a big contingent of who is out on the streets right now. I want to open up to questions that Ephraim has received, and I'm going to combine one question we've received with the last question I wanted to ask you, and then we'll start feeding you some questions from the audience, which is, have American Jews played a role in these reforms coming about? And then attached to that, what role do you think American Jews have right now in this moment as the judicial reforms are paused, but we all know are eventually going to move forward again, and the conversation continues?
That's a good question. It's a hard question. I would say that American Jews, I hate to say it, but I have to say it, American Jews probably can't really have much of a role. And the reason is that Israelis on both sides feel that something really fundamental is at stake. And so it's hard to even hear the opinions of outsiders. Whereas this issue has been on the New York Times front page and on the Wall Street Journal front page, and the president of France has weighed in and the president of the United States has weighed in. And Israelis just didn't notice because they believe on both sides that their lives, their sort of fundamental commitments and who they are and what their country will be in the going forward is at stake. And so the protest folks drew 1 in every 5 Israelis came out for these protests. That's astonishing. And when we poll support for the government, support for the government has dropped, incidentally, not because people oppose judicial reform. It has dropped because people think the government has handled judicial reform terribly. In other words, it's a competence. It's a vote of no confidence in the government's competence, not in the substance of the argument about the court. And so it has dropped, but it has dropped to 45% of the country. In other words, it's still enormous. And so it's hard to see how American Jews can really influence anything happening here.
And to the first part of the question, in terms of the reforms coming about, and before the call started, we were talking a bit about the group Kohelet. Like there have been a role that American Jews have always played in Israeli politics, and the fact that this has arisen right now is also the result of certain American Jewish groups having opinions on the issue. So could you speak a little bit about that, the role that took in the judicial reforms coming about, and if you see in light of that a role that we have now, as we did play a part in the first place, but you can explain.
Yeah. Yeah, American Jews from America expressing their opinions, I think, is not very it can't really influence Israelis when they care deeply about a question. In other words, American Jewish anger about the Western Wall compromise of a few years ago was very potent. Israelis heard it, but Israelis generally don't really care what happens at the West. It's not considered high on the agenda of Israelis' ordinary lives. But American Jewish money has had a profound effect on Israeli politics, and American Jewish ideas that have been brought to Israel with that money. The Kohelet Policy Forum is a very, very important conservative think tank. It provides policy papers for ministers in real estate law. Real detailed, complex. I think they have 150 researchers in that think tank in Jerusalem, and it is very conservative. And some of the people in it, especially a gentleman named Aviad Bakshi, were central in crafting. He has a doctorate in law. He's a serious legal scholar and a very conservative legal scholar, and he was very influential. And now Likud has appointed a negotiating committee to negotiate a compromise with the opposition parties. He is on Likud's negotiating committee, this Kohelet researcher. And so Kohelet is this very, very, there's nothing new about that. American Jewish money in the form of the New Israel Fund, in the form of generally funding a lot of the Israel Democracy Institute, which is a left-leaning think tank and policy shop. It's an interesting thing. When Americans come to Israel, when they actually make Aliyah, because you need to leave most Israeli Jews, the 3.5 million Olim of Israeli history were almost all refugees. Very, very few have ever come from communities that are safe. And when they do, they tend to be very passionate and very ideological people. And so we have American Jews are very well represented, far overrepresented on the far left. And they're far overrepresented from their actual numbers in the population, which maybe is 100,000 people, on the far right or on the very conservative outfits. And so they're activists. They're the loudest part of B'Tselem, and they're the loudest part of the judicial reform. The extreme. Not that they're wrong, and I'm judging them. Just they're on the far edge of that debate. And American Jews, in that sense, have been really central, both in money and both in activism on the extremes.
And at this moment, going forward, if the reforms were to be implemented, how do you see that affecting American Jewry? And in light of that, what role do you think going forward American Jewry will have to play?
I'll tell you, my sense is that what American Jews want from Israel, most broadly, American Jews is a big place. It's many different voices and many different kinds of people. But my sense is that what American Jews want from Israel is to just kind of basically be a decent country and not embarrass them, and not also be collapsing, and not also constantly be this narrative and source of so much, anxiety. American politics has enough anxiety, right? Israel should at least not be a source of anxiety. And if that is the case, I think I'm optimistic. That one of the curious things about this reform is that if a reform doesn't pass, if this reform is defeated outright and nothing changes, half the country will feel cheated. The right will feel cheated out of its election, out of literally winning an election and then being unable to do something that it has been talking about for 3 decades. And the court will remain this little bit of a strange outlier and an unhealthy, overpowerful court. If the reform, as the government proposed it on January 4th, is what passes, then we've lost all checks and balances in the system, and we've gone into a place that is, you have to trust the politicians to not want too much power, is the only safeguard we'll have for our democracy. But the funny thing is that the middle ground, if we reach that compromise, if both sides lose a lot and we end up with a middle ground between them, in other words, the court is weakened, but to satisfy the left, we get a Bill of Rights. And the basic laws, that take the basic law question, for example. You want to make basic laws immune to judicial review. You want to make them a real constitution. Fantastic. Make them hard to change. Make it make it take an 80-seat vote. No coalition in the history of Israel has ever had 80 seats in parliament. Make them forced to go across the aisle to the opposition and then be able to change a basic law. And suddenly you have a constitution, right? And so the middle ground, the place where we weaken the court, but build new checks and new balances, separate parliament from the government, add a second house of parliament with a veto that's regionally elected so that members of the parliament can stand on their own 2 feet against their own party leaders or against the executive branch. Give the president a veto. These are things I'm throwing out randomly off the top of my head. And some people have debated them, but the president is elected by the Knesset to 7-year terms, and it's a figurehead position. We'll give him a veto over laws that require a 2/3 majority to overcome. And then suddenly the Knesset of 7 years ago has a veto on the Knesset of today, which means that laws will change based on popular will, but slowly. That's protection. That is how it's supposed to work, right? So if we reach a middle ground, if this compromise works, if we get out of this politics of folly and just polarization that has become so extreme, and we actually, each side can force the other into a compromise, we will emerge a much stronger and more stable democracy, not less democratic going forward than we were, but much, much more democratic. That is not an original thought. That is President Isaac Herzog's argument. And I think most Israelis agree with him on that point. And then we would be much less embarrassing and much more stable and much more capable of also solving some of our really big questions. The biggest one, of course, being the Palestinian issue, but also ultra-Orthodox integration and education, and a lot of the problems that this country has managed to just completely avoid dealing with for too many years.
Thank you. Thank you so much for carving out that middle road and also making explicit President Herzog's proposal, because we've spoken a bit about the different ways that this could turn out from the extreme perspectives, but it's important to bear that in mind. And there is an urge for that to be the line that's taken. Many American Jewish organizations explicitly came out in support of that, including JFNA. And so it's helpful to have the landscape of different points of views to be able to situate ourselves in as the news evolves over the next days and weeks. I have a lot of questions from the audience, and we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but I'm going to ask one of them that's come up, which is, what is the interplay between these reforms, those affected by them that you've outlined a bit, and the uprise in violence, the cycle of violence that we've seen between Israelis and Palestinians in recent weeks? I know that's a big one, and we want to be able to get in a couple more questions before you would have
I'll keep it short.
We'll keep it as short as possible.
I'll keep it short. Unfortunately, this is a huge one. So if I'm keeping it short, I have to be dramatic. We are probably heading into real conflict. Another, quote unquote, intifada, or it doesn't matter what language you use about it. The Palestinian, Mahmoud Abbas is 87. He is on his way out. What comes after him is probably a fight among the Palestinians, an internal civil war for takeover of the Palestinian Authority / control of the West Bank. Hamas is far more popular than Fatah. Israel can't allow Hamas to take over the West Bank. It's simply as a security thing. The West Bank is the highlands that overlook all of our cities. And so there will be an internal Palestinian civil war Palestinian political factions generally, when they're fighting each other to gain authenticity and street credibility, they point attacks on the Israelis. And that's not the only, but that's one of the things that generates terrorism against Israel, is those politics. And Israel will actually also have to suppress a lot of those things. And so we're heading into a period, probably, everyone I know thinks this, including the real experts, we're heading into a period of much, much more violence. And that brings a lot of the issues of this government, the way that the far right has control of the police. There's a defense minister, Netanyahu just fired. He might be back already on the job, we're not sure. But also there is another minister in the defense ministry in charge of the West Bank, which is Bezalel Smotrich from the Religious Zionism Party. And they are people who believe in, massive crackdowns. Itamar Ben-Gvir himself, I've already described his, views and personality and history. And they'll be in charge of dealing with that violence. And this government is a government where Netanyahu, incidentally, has always tried to avoid violence and de-escalate historically. But he now has just literally, in terms of coalition math, he has no choice but to cede a lot of political ground to people who want the opposite policy. And so the weak danger that this government faces is that those internal government politics, just like the internal Palestinian politics, tend to produce more attacks on Israelis. The internal Israeli politics will probably produce much, much more aggressive Israeli responses. And so we're going into a period where everything that I've described that are the weaknesses this government is struggling with, Israelis are struggling with in terms of this government, will probably make things worse.
Well, there's a lot to consider there. There's a lot to consider in much that's been said. And as we're coming to the end of the call, I'd like to end with a question, I guess, on a positive note. Can you give us a positive, happy ending to this and explain what that might look like?
Okay, positive. Here we go. Yes. Yes, absolutely. I am a very big optimist. That doesn't mean it won't get much worse before it gets better, but I think that there are fundamental things that will make things, there are fundamental strengths to Israeli society that are going to see us through all of these different, overlapping crises. One of them is that the two sides have a point, and when the two sides have a point, when it's not a zero-sum conflict morally or substantively, then a compromise creates much more justice than either victory. And we're in that situation. We're in a conflict that is not zero-sum, but that is that more complex kind. And so it can end with more democracy. That's one, and probably will, just because both sides have proven they can't be wished away. That's one. The second one is Israel has this really annoying habit of building really strong and successful and serious institutions only after the absolute desperate collapse. In other words, it has to go over the cliff, be falling down the side of the cliff, and 9 feet before the ground builds the institution it actually needs to move forward successfully. That was true in the 80s. This is the example I love to give. We had 8 years of runaway triple-digit inflation in the 80s. The economy was decimated. And that made us write a law that made monetary policy in the Bank of Israel independent and reined in the unions. We still have unions; they're powerful unions, but they couldn't control the economy like they did before, and become one of the most fiscally responsible countries in the world. I think last year our deficit was 0, right? So we became one of the most fiscally serious and responsible countries on earth after shattering and destroying our economy. So I wish we could have done that before, but we don't have that capacity. And on 100 different things, the 73 war is an example, classic example of hubris and institutional, problems that we fixed. We fixed and became one of the most significant, in terms of intelligence networks, in terms of our capabilities, but we only fixed it after catastrophe. And this is one of those catastrophes. This feels like one of those catastrophes where we're going to come out of it with a court, with a constitutional order that has checks and balances, that has maybe a Bill of Rights. Netanyahu has promised the Bill of Rights twice in the last week. I wish he'd promised it 12 weeks ago. A lot of Israelis would have interpreted the reform differently had he done so, had he actually written one, right? But, you know, after the collapse of everything, suddenly Israelis tend to discover the right path forward. And so this feels like one of those moments, and I think we can very much follow that tradition that we have of doing the right thing when all other possibilities have been exhausted. And the last thing is, folks, we're one of the happiest countries in the world. The latest United Nations Happiness Index, Well-Being Index was published last week. We're number 4. We're number 4. We are a Scandinavian country. There are 3 Scandinavian countries ahead of us and 1 Scandinavian country behind us. And the reason Israel, weirdly, folks, we're not the wealthiest. We're not the happiest. We're the happiest. We're not the wealthiest. We're not, I mean, all these different measures, right? In terms of, we're very high in literacy, but in terms of academic accomplishment, we're not the best. We're not the, you try and find the correlation. We're one of the most religious and conservative of liberal democracies. We're, by the way, the most liberal of conservative religious countries. We are a very strange country to stick in number 4. But one of the major measures that UN report measures is something called social support or social capital. And social capital is families and communities who are there. Secular Israelis have more children per family than any developed nation. And the reason Israelis have more kids is that they have large families around them raising the kids. I don't know if it takes a village to raise a kid, as Hillary Clinton used to say, but it certainly takes grandparents and cousins. That definitely takes. I have 4 kids, and I'm a small family on my street. My wife is the oldest of 8. And that's, Israelis are, by the way, one of the happiest communities in Israel are the ultra-Orthodox, because that level of social support is really, really very powerful and intense. And so we have this strength that comes, by the way, that comes from a few things, but one of them is just that the West it's essentially capitalism. I mean, I'm a big fan of capitalism, but one of the downsides of capitalism is that people become very mobile, and Americans move once every 5 years on average out of their county, meaning they move to a place where they're distant from, and American family, I'm saying American just because you're American, this is identical in Australia and Canada and France and Germany and Spain and almost every liberal country in the West. Families are scattered and there isn't that same support system. Israel's too small to scatter, so there is. But the other reason is that we're very traditional. Half of us do come from the Arab world, and we have, in a way, a more moderate, the Mizrahi Jews have a much more moderate religion than the Ashkenazi Jews, who are very secular and know there isn't a God, and very religious and are absolutely willing to go to holy war over there being a God. And the Mizrahim look at this crazy Ashkenazim and they're just like, maybe there's a God, probably there's a God. You still got to do holidays because grandma's coming, right? That gives us this strength. The very fact that we're half Arab and half Western is one of the sources of our strength, and it is not something that's going away. And it creates a unity and a society that looks different and feels different from the West. All of the things that make Western lives miserable. Western lives are not miserable, but the factors causing some of the misery in Western lives, we are immune to, and the liberalism of the West we get to have, which some of those traditional societies don't. And so I think this country has basic strengths that will see it through.
I love that, Haviv, and it actually really resonates with me because from a personal standpoint, I lived in Scandinavia and I've lived in Israel, as Ephraim said, and I've lived in other countries in the Middle East. And I was thinking about that happiness index just recently, and I was thinking one of the points you highlighted is strength. And I think that resilience produces happiness. It might not be a common thought that hardship or adversity and getting through that could produce happiness because it's something we tend to avoid, but that actually adversity makes us stronger. And, Scandinavia deals with some of the harshest climate in the world. And, having lived in Finland, people are really resentful in the winter, but in the summer, they're happier than ever. And you think about all the complex politics and and just the tensions in Israeli society, but all of that cumulatively, when really faced fully and gotten through, and the compromises are made that take the best points from all the perspectives offered, it makes a stronger society and people are happier and better off for it. And so I love that. I think that's an excellent note to end on. And I want to be honoring your time and everyone else's time. So I want to thank you so much, Haviv, as a whole, for all of your insights and wisdom and the critical work and writing that you're doing right now. We're really lucky to have you as a resource for the community, and so happy to have you back here, and appreciate the knowledge that you've equipped us with to better navigate these difficult conversations and this issue going forward within the Jewish community in America and beyond all of our relatives everywhere that we're discussing this with, and within the communities outside the Jewish community that are asking us questions about this timely issue. Thank you.